Welcome to another deep dive. This one I think is going to be really fascinating for anyone who, well, anyone who likes to think deeply about reality, you know, like a philosopher.
Sins right up my alley.
I was hoping you'd say that. And, speaking of philosophy, that's exactly what we're diving into today. Specifically, the work of Walter Burley, a 14th century thinker.
Now, Burley might not be a household name, but trust me, he had a huge impact on the way we understand reality, knowledge, language, all that good stuff. And his ideas are still relevant today. Really, really fascinating stuff.
Right, and that's why we're going deep, deep, deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on him to really try and unpack his philosophical journey and, his key contributions.
It's like a philosophical treasure hunt.
Exactly. So let's set the stage. Like, who was Walter Burley? What was going on in the world back then?
Okay, so imagine 14th century Europe, a time of big intellectual ferment, right? Big pounds. Universities popping up, and right in the thick of it is Walter Burley, bouncing between Oxford and Paris, getting those fancy Master of Arts and Theology degrees.
Wow. Must have been a busy guy.
Oh, he was. And he wasn't just, collecting diplomas. This guy wrote like 50 works.
50? That's a lot of writing.
I know, right? He really wasn't afraid to dig into the big questions. And one of his most influential works, I'd say, was his commentaries on Aristotle's Ars Vetus and physics.
Ah, Aristotle.
Yeah.
The OG philosopher.
You got it. And those commentaries, by the way, they were studied all over Europe, especially in those up-and-coming Italian universities.
So his ideas really spread far and wide. He wasn't just some obscure scholar.
Nope. He was shaping the minds of generations of thinkers.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it. So let's talk more about his ideas. What were some of the big issues that Burley grappled with?
Well, like many of the brainy folks back then, Burley was super into the debate over realism, especially this thorny question of universals. And early on, he kind of landed in this camp we call moderate realism.
Moderate realism. Now, for those of us who might not have our philosophy dictionaries handy, could you give us a quick rundown of what that means?
Sure. So moderate realism, it's this idea that universals, those abstract concepts like justice or humanity, they have a real existence, but they're not out there in some separate Platonic realm like some philosophers thought. No. For moderate realists, universals, they exist in individual things.
So, like, humanity exists because individual humans exist. It's not floating around out there on its own.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
Oh.
And what makes Burley's take on moderate realism super interesting is how he zeroes in on categories. Like, he was really insistent that only substances, quantities, and qualities were truly fundamental, truly real. The other categories, like relations, positions, actions, all that stuff, he considered them real aspects of these three core categories.
So he's making a pretty bold statement about the structure of reality itself. Like, it's not just about how we mentally categorize things. He's saying there's this whole metaphysical hierarchy going on.
You got it. And to really get how radical this was, you got to picture the philosophical landscape back then. Thinkers were totally obsessed with how language, thought, and reality all fit together. And Burley, with his meticulous approach to categories, he was right at the forefront of that whole movement.
He was kind of a philosophical trailblazer in a way.
Exactly. So he's got this really, really interesting take on moderate realism, but then enter William of Ockham. I think we all know what's coming next.
Oh yeah, Occam, that guy. I've heard those two had some pretty legendary philosophical battles.
You could say that. Occam comes along, super sharp, razor sharp intellect, and he's like ready to take down some long-held assumptions. And his critiques of realism, especially how we understand universals, man, they were like a philosophical earthquake, really shaking things up.
It sounds like things are about to get even more interesting.
Oh, you have no idea. Buckle up.
So, how did Burley handle this? I mean, this is a huge challenge coming from Occam. Did he kind of back down? Yeah. Or maybe just refine his ideas a bit?
Oh, no, it's way more interesting than that. See, instead of backing down, Burley takes Occam's criticisms and uses them to double down on realism. It's like he's saying, okay, you think universals are a problem? Well, let me show you how real they really are.
Wow, so he's like challenge accepted.
Yeah, exactly. And he goes all in on this idea, really hammering home the separation between universals and those particular things. He drops the whole moderate realism thing where universals exist in things. Now they're totally separate, almost like, those perfect forms that Plato talked about.
So pretty big shift from his earlier work then.
Huge. And it's not just about universals. This shift impacts all his other ideas, like how he thought about categories. Remember how he was saying only substances, quantities, and qualities were really real? Well, now he changes his tune completely. Now, every single category is really distinct, mirroring those separate universals.
So he's really going all in on this new foundation.
Hmm.
What about those real propositions he talked about before? Did those change too?
You bet they did. Those real propositions, they're not just in our minds anymore. They're out there in the world. They're the things that make our sentences true or false. Like, for every true sentence, bam, there's a real proposition hanging out somewhere making it true.
So it's not just that language describes reality, it's like language is a mirror image of reality. The structure has to match perfectly.
Right. That's a pretty wild idea when you think about it. And it raises all sorts of questions about, well, about truth, right? And how we figure out what's true.
Yeah, for sure. So this shift in Burley's thinking, was it a sudden thing? Like one day he woke up and decided to completely revamp his whole philosophy?
That's a question that scholars are still debating. Was it a total break, like a revolution, or was it more of a gradual evolution, like building on his earlier ideas? We don't know for sure, but it's clear that Occam really pushed him to think differently.
It's kind of like those philosophical debates really forged his ideas, made them stronger.
Exactly. And, to really get Burley's later thinking, we got to talk about his idea of macro objects. That's what he called those everyday things we see around us, like a tree, a rock, a person.
Okay, so at first glance, it seems pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
What's so philosophically interesting about a rock?
Well, Burley didn't see it as simple at all. He thought of a macro object like this complex structure built out of different kinds of forms. It's like a philosophical blueprint for a thing.
A blueprint. Okay, I'm intrigued. So what are the parts of this blueprint?
At the center, you have the primary substance. That's the basic stuff of a thing, like the rockness of a rock. But it's not just this formless blob of essence. It gets its shape and specific qualities from what Burley called substantial and accidental forms.
Wait, so the primary substance is like the raw material, and these forms are what shape it.
Yeah, kind of. So the substantial form is what makes something the kind of thing it is. It's what makes that primary substance a rock and not, say, a potato. And then the accidental forms, those are all the qualities that can change without changing what a thing fundamentally is. Like a rock size or color or texture, those are accidental forms.
So the substantial form makes it a rock, and the accidental forms make it that specific rock.
Exactly. And of course, Burley being Burley, he's got to connect all this back to language, right? How do we express all these complex structures with our words?
I was just thinking that. He seems super fascinated by how language and reality are connected. What does he say about that?
Well, he takes his earlier ideas and, makes them even more precise. He still believes that simple expressions like names name things directly. But when it comes to more complex stuff like sentences, well, things get really interesting.
This sounds like it's about to get pretty deep.
Yeah.
How did his view of sentences change?
Remember those real propositions? Well, now they become central to how sentences work. Burley says a sentence can only be true if it lines up perfectly with a real proposition out there in the world. And it's not just that it describes it. The structure has to match exactly.
It's like language is a map of reality, but it has to be a super, super accurate map.
And to make sure that map is as accurate as possible, he even refines his ideas about meaning. He goes beyond just intention and extension and starts talking about sense and reference, too.
Whoa, okay, slow down a bit. Intention, extension, sense, reference. I think we're losing some folks here. Can you break this down for us?
Sure, sure. So sense is like the mental concept a word brings to mind. It's what you understand when you know what a word means. Reference is the actual thing in the world that the word points to.
So the sense of tree is the idea of a tree, and the reference is that specific oak tree over there.
You got it. And Burley thought both of these, sense and reference, are super important for how language connects to reality. And, it all ties back into his big questions about how we know things.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this focus on language wasn't just some side hobby for Burley, right?
Yeah.
It feels like it's at the core of all his philosophy.
Exactly. He was really, really concerned with how we know individual things. Like, how do we know that specific tree and not just the general concept of tree?
That's the classic problem of the singular, right?
Yeah.
Do we know this tree or just treeness?
Exactly. And Burley, well, his ideas about how we know singulars, they actually shifted quite a bit throughout his career. Early on, he thought we mainly grasp universals, and those singular things are kind of blurry to our minds. But later on, he starts saying something different. You're right, it really is a big change. It seems like he starts to think that we actually can know those singular things directly, and that, in a way, it's the universals that are more abstract.
So he completely flips his earlier view.
That's pretty wild. I wonder what made him change his mind. Do you think it had anything to do with his whole radical realism thing? I think you're onto something there. When he shifts to the super strong realism, he really has to rethink how our minds, which are kind of stuck in the world of particulars, can actually grasp those universals, those separate abstract entities. It's like he had to rebuild his whole theory of knowledge from the ground up.
So it wasn't just about changing what exists, is ontology, but also about how we know those things, is epistemology. It really shows how all these different parts of philosophy are connected.
For sure. And it makes you think, if universals are really out there on their own, how do we even know them? Our
Yeah.
minds are stuck in this world of specific individual things. How do we bridge that gap?
That's a really good question. It's like, how do we connect the abstract and the concrete? Did Burley have any answers?
Well, he definitely didn't shy away from the tough questions. In his later writings, it seems like he's saying, okay, we know singulars directly, but those universals, we have to know them in a more abstract way, maybe through some kind of intellectual intuition. He's wrestling with this problem of how our limited minds can grasp something that goes beyond individual things.
It sounds like he was a pretty honest thinker. He didn't try to oversimplify things or pretend he had all the answers.
Right. He was willing to wrestle with those really hard questions. And by doing that, I think he opened up all sorts of new possibilities for philosophy. What do you think is his biggest contribution?
Hmm, that's a tough one. But I think his commitment to really pushing the boundaries of realism is super impressive. He didn't just settle for that comfortable, moderate position. He took Occam's criticisms, which were basically trying to dismantle realism, and he used them to build an even stronger, more radical version. It's like a masterclass in philosophical innovation.
Totally agree. It's like those critiques didn't shut him down, they just made him think harder and come back even stronger.
It's pretty inspiring. It shows how criticism can actually make our ideas better.
Definitely. So, if you were talking to a philosopher today, someone working on these same kinds of questions about reality, knowledge, language, what would you tell them about Burley?
I'd say go read Burley. His analysis is so careful, so detailed, and he's not afraid to challenge those basic assumptions that everyone takes for granted. And I mean, the guy was just so tenacious, he didn't give up even when faced with some really tough criticism. Those are all qualities that I think any philosopher could learn from.
Well said. Even after all these centuries, Burley's work still feels so relevant. His ideas about universals, language, how we know stuff, they're still at the heart of philosophical debates today. It shows that great philosophy really does stand the test of time.
It really does. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from all this is, well, it's that Burley's journey from moderate to radical realism shows us how connected ontology, semantics, and epistemology really are. Like, we can't understand how we know the world without figuring out what exists and how we talk about it.
Absolutely. It's a good lesson for anyone who wants to go deeper into philosophy or just, anyone who wants to understand the world better.
And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us as we explored the fascinating world of Walter Burley. We hope you learned something new and maybe even got inspired to do some philosophical exploring of your own.
Yeah.
Until next time.